Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite para você que está assistindo o nosso seminário sobre demanda. Eu gostaria de dar as boas-vindas e agradecer seu interesse nesse seminário intitulado Por que o suporte Omnichannel será o novo normal?, apresentado em inglês pelo meu colega Kevin Patterson, gerente de desenvolvimento de negócios da Axios Systems, e Troy Dumoulin, vice-presidente de pesquisa e desenvolvimento da Pink Elephant. Meu nome é Daniel Maia e eu sou responsável nas Américas pelas operações de parcerias da Axios Systems, fabricante líder de mercado de soluções de gerenciamento de serviços e gerenciamento de ativos de TI. Para mais informações sobre a Axios Systems e seus produtos, incluindo estudos de casos, funcionalidades, vídeos ou solicitar uma apresentação da solução, por favor visitem www.axiossystems.com ou me enviem um e-mail em daniel.maia@axiossystems.com. Neste seminário, Troy e Kevin discutem por que o atendimento Omnichannel será o novo normal e como definir uma estratégia de montagem do atendimento Omnichannel. Na versão sob demanda que você está assistindo, você tem a oportunidade de tirar suas dúvidas me enviando um e-mail com suas perguntas que eu encaminharei para as respostas. Sem mais demoras, vamos ouvir ao que Troy Dumoulin e Kevin Patterson têm a nos dizer. Então, Troy, Kevin, é com vocês.
It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. Let's dive into the agenda for our Omnichannel support webinar. The first thing we're going to talk with you about is the drivers for this change and why we feel this is the new normal of support going forward. We'll then talk about the service desk and the current state of multi-channel support and look at the vision of omni-channel support as we move forward over the next few months and years. We'll also discuss how to develop an omni-channel strategy, talk about seamless channel support and automation throughout your different tool sets. We'll look at emerging support models, including swarm techniques across the enterprise. And lastly, we'll talk about omni-channel support and organizational cultural change as it pertains to your organization. Over to you, Troy.
Thank you, Kevin. It's awesome to be back with you folks again. So as Kevin pointed out, we're going to start with the why. It's always good to start there. It gives me the basis for why are we even talking about this. And the reality is that we have to understand there's a set of drivers behind this conversation, and they're not just recent. They've been evolving for some time now. And it begins with this concept of value in the digital economy, in the digital age. And we see this concept being kind of explored and expanded upon by the service management community, where they're looking at value in a multi-dimensional way. And there's this concept of quality that's always been present, right? There's this functional quality that I'm able to deliver through my digital automation, but there's also the aspect of quality which is non-functional. Let's make sure you're safe and you're protected and you don't end up in the an orange jumpsuit and end up in some kind of lockdown. So there's this quality of both functional and non-functional. But that's not enough in today's age, because at the same time we give the quality aspect of value, which is to achieve the expected outcome functionally or non-functionally. We're also in a context of competition, because there are so many alternatives out there now, whether you're looking at internal alternatives to consider, but also now thinking about external options, hosted or cloud-based or competitive options that are facing you. So quality isn't enough anymore. You've got to be understanding that you give good quality, but is it at the speed that the organization needs? Right? Am I able to react and respond fast enough? Speed to market, speed to customer, speed to repair of service, right? This concept of speed has to be embedded in this concept of value. Now, that's great. You get great quality, you're getting decent speed, but now what's the cost of doing that comparatively to, again, these alternatives? Because unless you have a really good business case, if you're 10 times more expensive than the alternative, that becomes a challenge as well, especially as our industry moves from these differentiated solutions to more utility or commoditization type services. So cost is going to be always in the context of value. There's an interesting concept that service always has an economic context to it, right? Am I getting a good deal? Will be the final question that we ask once we deal with quality and speed. So there's this concept of having to hit all three of these, right? And I began this conversation, Kevin, by talking about digitally disruptive competition, because we're there, right? We've got this kind of built on the web, unicorn organization that once was a bookseller, and now they've got financial services square in their spotlight, and they've already done the food thing, right? So you got the unicorn coming for you. But there's also these other more brick and mortar organizations that you've traditionally competed with, and they're leveraging these digital capabilities faster than you, which again puts you in this disadvantage. So for some organizations, they begin the path for digital engagement, digital enablement, because literally I'm in a horse race and a unicorn race, right? But that's not everybody, right? If you're a government agency or you're not in a competitive scenario, then that's probably not your driver. So there's two others that I want to bring your attention to. One is productivity challenges. Think about it. When was the last time you came to work and you were able to keep up that the work you got done today matched the work that came in the door, right? We are facing this epidemic growth of the backlog of work behind all people and teams. The work is piling up faster than we can actually get to it, and we're falling behind. So traditional analog ways of doing things just not cutting it anymore. So in that context, you have this productivity enhancement you're looking for through the collaboration, engagement tooling, and solutions that you're implementing. Now, that was, until recently, probably the two primary drivers until recently, because a third driver has appeared, which is surprise disruption or complete now discontinuity of doing it the old way. Your operating model is totally turned on its head and you didn't expect it. Now you're forced to find creative workforce management solutions to basically to go immediately to this distributed remote teaming that you've got to somehow pull together. And so if there's ever been a business case for digital engagement, digital enablement, and the concept of creating digital channels, well, here's our third driver. No one basically is escaping this one. So Kevin, your thoughts? Are you seeing this out there in your customer base, these kind of drivers that are pushing the question?
We are actually, yeah. So it's funny. Earlier in the year, the productivity challenges were very pronounced with every prospect that I spoke with our new business side of the house. And I think with the this global pandemic, that's really exacerbated some of those problems. So now we're seeing that that workload just didn't go away, right? So they still have that challenge, and now they're finding themselves working remotely. So I've gone from having, 2 or 3 screens to 1 screen and on my laptop, and I'm struggling to keep up with that demand. So we are definitely hearing and seeing the same things that you're talking about today.
So this is a challenge that is hitting us all, regardless if you're in a competitive situation or not, folks. It's just suddenly we're faced with this question at an accelerated rate. That's the surprise disruption. So I think if anyone is on the webinar today that isn't experiencing one of these three things, you're probably in some alternative universe somewhere, right? So that's the world we face today. Now, again, this wasn't something that was simply invented since the pandemic hit us. We've been on this trend of digitization for some time. In fact, probably the most overhyped phrase in 2019 was this concept of digital transformation. And it was largely focused on the competitive or productivity concepts we've talked about so far. But let's unpack this word transformation, right? Because it's indicative of kind of leveraging into this discussion around what is multi and then omni-channel. It's doing work completely different. That is what transformation means. It's different than the way we used to do it, and it's completely different. And so if you think about that, if you kind of unpack this word transformation, you look at these three bubbles here that we get from the ITIL for high velocity IT book. It's really like this definition, right? It's using these digital technologies to do things differently, right? Or do completely different things. It means completely changing and reframing the way we used to work, right? Maybe the way we structure our teams, the way these teams collaborate versus past work collectively or sequentially. We'll talk about that later when we talk about this concept of swarming. And if that's the case, then the portfolio strategies we had in 2019 probably got thrown out the window in 2020, because that means we have a lot more investment to make in these new digital engagement channels and support models, right? So it's a complete discontinuity of what we thought we were doing into this new way of working. That is what transformation is. In fact, I saw an article recently that said the reality is that most of us are facing the fact that what we thought would be business in 2020, right, based on 2019 forecasting, was completely thrown out the window by this surprise discontinuity. So we are in a world of, if we weren't before, transformation, but now on a fast track. So this is where we want to start talking about the people side, right? Because when we think about omnichannel, we're going to even end the webinar with this conversation. It really is going to be about people, process, and technology, but it starts and ends with people, supported by process and technology, because you can't get there without process and technology. But here's the thing. When you think about organizational change, right, there's a difference between the word change and the concept of a transition. The change can be gradual, or it could be abrupt, right? So you got this new situation, and obviously what we're facing is an abrupt change. We didn't even get asked if we wanted to, or did we want to kind of go along with the ride. We get kind of thrown into the hot water, and now we've got to figure out how to swim. The problem isn't the fact that the changes are, the changes happen. It's transition, which is the challenge, which is the people side of the equation, to go through this concept of completely changing ways of working, methods of teaming, and the automation solutions we probably need to do that with, right? And that's going to take time, and that's the people concept. And that's where we're either going to succeed or fail. And that's where we're going to go slow or fast, right? Because the change has already happened, but how fast will we experience the transition? And based on how fast, if you're in the competitive mode, will you be able to survive this, thrive in this, or will you be under the bus as opposed to on it? Right? This is where the transition comes in, right? So this is key that we want to talk about. And one of the transitions that we're facing in the world of IT support is at the service desk. And again, we're going to make this point several times, Kevin and I. These aren't new concepts. They just got accelerated. So let's unpack this concept of service desk by going back first to the goal, right? The purpose of the service desk. And this is right again out of ITIL, ITIL 4. So the purpose of this service desk practice, and we talk about practice now more than just function, because your service desk strategy can be many organizations collectively working together for that front door kind of customer engagement experience, right? So it's a capability or practice, not just one team. It could be a collection of teams. But the reality is we're still all about incident resolution, mean time to repair or restore, complaint handling, and we're that first point of contact still. We're trying to provide that single pane of glass, right? This don't make me think, where do I go get help if I need help, or do I want something, how do I ask for it, right? This service desk, whether it's physical or virtual or a combination, we're still going for the POC, point of contact. But how do we do this now in a world of you've got many options? That's an interesting question, and that's the question this webinar is facing, right? And this is part of this digital journey, because these channels that we're going to talk about now are in essence, well, when you're remote, all digital. Because I would like to say that I can walk up to my service desk and tap the friendly person on the shoulder right now, but that's just not happening. So I'm required to engage through other means. So again, all communication and language begins with a shared definition of terms. So this is a good place to start if we're going to have a conversation. Let's gain a shared understanding of some key definitions here, right? So multi-channel, this is quite interesting. This is simply, let's try another channel. Let's give them another option. Let's give them another choice. And so when you think about this, when you go beyond 2, right, you consider yourself possibly being in the world of multi-channel. Now, Kevin and I were joking before, said, well, why 2? And he said, well, it's more than, it's more than 2. So it's, what would you say, Kevin? It was It's not dual.
Dual channel support.
After you go past dual, what do you use? Well, apparently it's going to be multi, and then we're going to talk about omni, right? But this multi-channel can be very much still me, the provider, has a great idea. We're going to give them yet another pathway of entrance to this point of contact, right? So in this context, it's not necessarily the customer or the user who's driving the channel. It's possibly the provider, right? It's simply a multiplicity, and that's why we talk about multiple. But omni-channel has a completely different paradigm. Omni-channel has two differences that make it different than multi. One is that it's a customer-centric service model. So we talk about inside out or outside in. Are we driving customer support by an outside in push? I'm your supplier and I will determine what is best for your interest and the channels that you, the customer, should use. That's a push. That's an inside out. An omni-channel says, no, we have a consumer-based organization or society. They're used to leveraging all these different channels, and what they're looking for is to use the channels they're familiar with, right, to engage with the service organization. So this customer-centric, what channels does the customer want to use, is the starting point that they choose, right? Channel of their choice, as you see in the bold term. But here's the other differentiator between multi and omni. You see, multi simply says I got more than two. Omni says I have this integrated, seamless, holistic experience. I can enter one channel, choose to use another one over here, and there's a complete seamless integration between them, right? So that I don't find myself in a completely isolated channel. And that takes a lot of back-end sophistication. So this omni-channel premise has this holistic integration side of it. But right now, what we've got, and this is what I loved in the abstract, was this patchwork of tools and technologies that have grown over time. Someone's best idea, our legacy. We did it because the previous organization leadership said we're going to do this, and now we still do that, and now we do this over here. So this patchwork approach of tools is what we often end up with, but that's not anywhere near this concept of omni that we're describing. Thoughts, Kevin, on that? What's your experience in the industry and the customers you're dealing with and the challenges they're facing here?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? So I know when I talk to people in the field or on the phone, not really in the field anymore, it was seen as, well, we're deploying these new tools, so it must be omni-channel, not multi-channel support, and that just wasn't the case. So a good example was, very early in the pandemic, people started rolling out Microsoft Teams. Most organizations I talked to, that was kind of like the new shiny thing, and when I'm talking with them, it was like, well, yeah, we're doing this omni-channel support. I'm like, well, really? Well, what happens when you're having this Teams conversation between support and an end user after that conversation's done? And that information was being lost. So I think that was the biggest, aha moment for a lot of people was, we've been rolling out this new technology, which is fantastic. You've got video, you've got chat, you can screen share. It was doing everything you could possibly want, but the net result was when you were done with that session, you lost that data. So because it wasn't kind of omni-channel designed, you lost so much. And that was kind of what we saw early on, was people were deploying tools faster than they were thinking about what the experience should be on the back end. And that's, I think, where people are today. They've realized, they've been losing so much that now it's time to rethink and make sure we take an omni-channel strategy to kind of patching things together properly versus just ad hoc throwing tools in the infrastructure. Other tools are the same way. Slack, live chat. If these things aren't integrated, then you're losing so much information between these interactions that you're really taking a step backwards. So that's what we've been seeing, Troy, over the last few months.
You made me think about something else right there, Kevin. You and I were talking about this Accenture article that I was just recently reading, and they were talking about that the cultural challenges we face around silos. Often what will happen is that the same tools will be used multiple times by different silos. And so what we're seeing is not a reduction of cost, back to the word of value we talked about earlier, but an increased cost because now we got redundancy, right? We've got multiple channels, some of them legacy because they're still hanging around and we can't deal with them because we can't deal with technical debt, and some of them simply because, you know, one group wouldn't allow the other group to get access to it, so we bought the same tool from the same vendor and didn't integrate them, and so we lose information. We can't do any kind of data mining across these channels, so we're losing that too, and we're increasing costs. So just by putting out multiple channels, it doesn't mean we're getting benefit without this integrated back end that you're describing. That makes sense? Okay.
It makes complete sense, Troy.
So, you know, the world is our oyster, folks, when it comes to opportunities for multi and then omni-channel. You know, we're seeing a lot of these traditional ones like phone calls and emails being supplemented by the greatest, you know, cool kid on the street, which is the automated AI chat bot, right? We're seeing still the need to offer the service desk, and maybe we still want to hold on in some ways to that kind of, you know, expert desk that we developed around the physical on-prem side of things. We're getting into the mobile premise because that's certainly an expectation that I can switch to my mobile device, you know, from the office or corporate device and still have a seamless experience and reference. And even now the concept of, you know, how do I get engaged with forums, whether they're on-premise forums within the organization or where the organization is seeing a leakage of support to outside forums because they can't get the inside, you know, people to pay attention to them. How do I now kind of engage with those in the context of this multi-channel? Because the old saying is you're darned if you do and you're more darned if you don't, because if you ignore those forums outside that are right now probably denigrating your experience and your service, you know, provider concept, then you're going to actually make more enemies. So you've got to engage with these forums and be part of that as part of your channel. So I've got to pull all of these somehow together, right? Versus this patchwork and kind of unplanned approach. And so we've got multiple options and opportunities. What are we going to use, and how do we use a pull or customer-centric view of, you know, responding to customer need versus what we think should be? So that kind of, you know, comes to this concept that we have no shortage of tools out there, whether they're telephony systems or workflow management concepts, whether they're remote access, configuration management. When we think about the complexity, right, of our automation and tooling environment, it starts to get daunting. So what do we do? How do we rationalize? How do we simplify? How do we integrate this? And that's where it becomes an interesting challenge, right? We've scrambled, and perhaps what we are experiencing right now is the effect of the scramble, but now we've got to come off the scramble to more of an intentional approach to this. So we got multi. That's a good first step. It's better than having only one. Sorry, you can't deal with me as a service desk unless you send me an email. I'm sorry, that just does not cut it today, folks. One way of getting support, or email and phone call. You're not going to win friends and influence, you know, anyone with that kind of traditional approach. You're going to have to expand your horizons here on the technology side. Your challenge is going to be integrating it, right? To Kevin's point earlier. So, you know, when you're out there, Kevin, and you're looking at this kind of patchwork quilt, what are the challenges that you see facing these organizations?
Yeah, the biggest thing I think is it's the influx of data from so many different places is really hard to manage. So I know, you know, this is 20 years ago when I used to sit on the service desk. I had one job, Troy, and it was when the phone rang and the light flashed, I picked it up, and that was the channel in which I communicated with the customer. Now, as you just kind of laid out, there's so many different entry points and so much technology that's supposed to be helping us, but in all actuality, it's not, because we're still struggling to, you know, intake the work, provide service, and then get the customer on their way. And that's, we're still seeing that as one of the biggest challenges today is, you know, everybody wants to roll out more channels, but, you know, they're not able to manage the ones they have. I think what I see in the field today is, you know, I think most customers, or most of our prospects, have kind of rolled out the big three, I call it. They've got great voice and phone support. I'd say about 98% or so, intake calls for over the phone still. About 85 or 86% are offering email as a channel. So that's another channel coming in. They're having to manage. Some manage it by having their tool consume it. Some manage an actual inbox, which it raises its own problems of keeping track of that. And then the third channel that's most popular is in person, which, as you talked about, is really no longer an option. So, about 60% of people I talk to have had that as an actual way of getting work in. And again, the biggest problem comes in when you try to understand the customer and the services you support as a whole, right? Because again, going back to the different channels, I lose so much by not having a holistic system of all the interactions we've had with them via text or via live chat, and then they call on the phone, and if I don't have access to that, it really holds us back. And that's where we're hearing a lot of people come to us and say that. And that's what we're trying to solve over the next, I think, few months, is helping organizations look at that big picture, the holistic view, and kind of drive them in the right direction.
So you made me think about the whole, current hot trending topic of, the promise of machine learning, artificial intelligence, right? So AI ops and chat ops, they're all about automating all of these systems, but they depend on a collective data model, a shared data source, where I've pulled the data from all these channels together for pattern recognition and correlation, right? So you can't even begin to leverage the emerging technology of ML and AI unless you begin to pull the data on the back end together. And I think that's a key thing that you said a few minutes ago, that if you want to take advantage of these big trends, then you're going to have to figure out how to integrate these channels. And that's a key message, folks. The tool
That's
alone,
a great point. So
go ahead.
Yeah, and early on with the AI, we saw a lot of vendors actually put together these chatbots and virtual agents that were really just standalone. They really didn't tie into a system. They would actually just were glorified knowledge bases where you type in information and there'd be some natural language processing to find the right knowledge article and kind of type it back to you kind of real time. And again, so it's a great example of a multi-channel support model, because you're doing it kind of siloed over here, and you're not able to take full advantage of the structured data you have in your back-end system. So it really does make sense to be able to have that bot technology seamlessly integrate to your full service management application, so you can leverage all the information to get a clear picture of their customer, what their entitlements might be, what services they subscribe to. It's a much better customer experience, because it's not just about fixing their issue. That definitely is what we're trying to do, but it's also providing a great experience. We want to keep that customer satisfaction score relatively high, and we find that looking at analytics for the current channels people use, the live methods of interacting with customers get the highest scores. Like voice is very high, phone's very high, in person used to be very high, but things like email was low with customer sat. The virtual agents and the chatbots has the potential to be high. We just have to get a better customer experience. I think right now the average virtual agent's resolving like less than 10% of issues on first contact. So that's a very large percentage of things that aren't being solved. And historically we've seen organizations that when they roll out these virtual agents, if that virtual agent can't solve the issue, they give you a hyperlink to then click on a button and go to a portal or go somewhere else. And that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for that integrated experience where if a bot can't help you, wouldn't it be great if a live agent stepped into that exact session that you're in, that you started on your terms, to be able to provide that service? And that's, I think, one of the goals here for Omnichannel, is to really not just solve the issue at best cost and the best quality, but keeping the customer sat high as well.
Extremely well said, which is a beautiful segue into the fact that once we've got the technology in place, we also have to consider, coming back to the people element, the teaming and structural approaches that we're going to need to put together. Because the best tool in the world, folks, won't solve cultural or teaming challenges, right? So we've got to find ways to integrate not just the solutions we use, but the teaming structures we have around these solutions. And so, there's different methods for how people get access to support, right? There's traditional concept of, call the service desk, and, somebody on the other end will be, polite and pleasant and possibly be able to help me, that'd be awesome. But more and more organizations are finding, that people want to begin using the self-help options, right? Because if they don't find it helpful, then they're going to go off to YouTube, right? And so, that's the concept. The support team, this traditional kind of first, second, third level, this is all still there. But what we now need to think about is beyond that. So we think to the things to the right. So how do we seamlessly integrate now our suppliers? Because as we move more and more services into the cloud, which by the way simply means more outsourcing of my capabilities, right? Because that's what cloud is, just slivers of my organizational capability being sourced to someone else and it's computing over there, right? How do I now integrate my local support teams and models to this now growing complexity of external vendors? And how do I do that? In fact, if you take this conversation far enough, we start to talk about something called service integration and management, or SIAM, which is a whole other concept around the service management community, that you need to basically create this seamless engagement model of not just the people who share your brand, but anyone you've plugged in to your value chain as a organization who provides support. Now, again, I can't go into detail on this right now. There's a whole different way of looking at that versus a transactional provider who provides, widgets or pizza to your door, literally or metaphorically, to one you've now engaged as a strategic and great, embedded partner that's managing a major part of your value chain. That will change. That's part of this whole concept of SIAM. Right, so there's that. Then there's this concept of temporary cross-functional teams. This is emerging, but it's not new, because the whole problem management, problem solving, and before that, this lean, and then we talk about Kaizen teams. We create this pulled together group of people from different areas, subject matter, interests, and disciplines to problem solve something holistically, right? We'll talk more about that when we talk about swarming. But there's another interesting premise that often people don't understand, or don't really think about anyway, is that we know the difference between a normal incident and a major incident, right? So, and we'll talk about that in the context of swarming again. A normal incident management is something where I can tolerate some kind of delay in mean time to repair, that I can pass the incident ticket along like a baton at a relay race, right? It goes from first to second to third level. But when we get to a major incident, there is no tolerance for that kind of sequential passing of work. And so we all swarm the issue. And that's what we're going to talk about next, where we move from a sequential to this now collective approach, which is what we're going to describe as a drop-in swarm. So that's something we're going to pick up on and build on. But the thing I want to talk about, what you see the far right, is really there's 3 levels of detect and respond. There's normal, there's major, but when does a major become a crisis? At what point does a major incident, do you lose patience with the major incident process and have to trigger a completely different practice in our process to go into your disaster recovery mode? I want you to think about detect and respond in this context, and the collective way we do that as a community, like a 3-layer cake, right? We normally think about the interface between normal and major. That's a transition that's fairly common and we understand well. But there is this translation layer from major to DR, disaster recovery. And we don't want to spend time when that actually happens figuring out, okay, how do we make that decision? Who makes that decision? Who gets the call? And how do we transition to this 3rd level of organizational capability around support? So we need to think about it expanding into that concept as well. Now, perhaps you already do, but in my experience, Kevin, a lot of folks will have this kind of DR group over there doing BIAs, business impact analysis. It's completely disconnected from any kind of day-to-day incident or service restoration process. So that's another challenge I see.
So we see that as well, Troy. So it's very much a siloed activity going on.
Mm-hmm. So let's unpack this. We've got the why. We know we need an integrated set of solutions and tools, not just this patchwork that's been bolted onto your old ITSM tool, right? And we now look at this different teaming set of models, and we're going to unpack that further with the swarming concept in one moment. But I can't go further without understanding that what does that mean to the ye old service desk professional? Well, in that case, if I'm going to have a person be aware of and try to integrate and hold together multiple channels, that person is going to have a fairly systemic or holistic mindset. There's going to be a set of skills which are very broad for this person. Now, this isn't new, because you're going to say, well, yes, the perfect service desk person is both technically savvy, they're organizationally savvy and with the business understanding. They're also high in the EQ space. They got big on the empathy side of things. They're great communicators. They actually can speak people and speak to people like they're people, right? So you got this kind of holistic person that we pay probably the least amount of money. And the old saying is usually, you get what you pay for, because we find that while we say this, we don't see the respect due, and we often say, well, that's the most commoditized role in my organization, so let's just offshore it. And you get exactly what you expect, right? You get a basic call dispatch, which is not going to get anywhere close to this omni-channel integrated concept. So we talk out of our mouth about this perfect kind of concept of a service desk professional with this holistic set of skills, but then we don't exercise that when we actually put this team together, or we hire for these folks. Is that your experience, Kevin? That's certainly mine.
So it is actually. So years ago, when I helped put together a service desk, we were looking for the wrong types of people. It's very easy to start looking for people that are highly technical, but early on in their career, because he's got technical chops, right? He's able to solve lots of problems. That's what we want to raise our FCR. When in all actuality, that is not what you're looking for, right? It's these key skills that you really need to focus on with the analysts. The emotional IQ, the empathy. These are things that really can't be taught, right? And then when we set up our curriculum for training, I think we did a 2-week training course for agents when we brought them on. And then continue training every year, about 10 to 15 hours every year, to kind of keep things, fresh in their minds from policies and procedures. But you can't train some of these soft skills. It's easy to have a great knowledge base. Well, it's not easy, but it's doable to have a great knowledge base that anybody with basic technical skills can leverage. But what's not easy is taking somebody that's extremely technical, that has, poor empathy or no empathy at all and no emotional IQ, and then having them fill this role. So that's kind of what I saw when I was on the operations side trying to staff a desk. Going forward to today, and working with Axios and helping organizations, set up tools and have work with the people in training, I see these skills are really helping people shine in that role. And again, going back to your point, they're one of the lowest paid technical resources in the organizations, but they are really the face of IT in the modern era, right? This has single point of contact. Historically it was you talk to them on the phone, but now with some organizations doing, the video chat, stuff like that, they really are your face of IT when you're actually working from a service and support perspective. So I think, focusing on developing these resources, giving them the right tools and the right training is going to be key for your success moving forward in the modern age.
Mm-hmm. So in the new emerging concepts around the ITIL4 service management model, we talk about the difference between systems thinking versus analytical thinking. The analytical thinker basically breaks it all down to the one thing, and that focus is myopic, right on that one thing, and that's the only thing I'm looking at. Right? Again, this is the anti-pattern to multi-channel, omni-channel concept, versus a systems thinker thinks in a holistic, more synthesis way. And so that's a very challenging skill to find, because our normal go-to is analytical. So again, this concept of holistic systems thinking, multiple skills is going to be key. Now, again, talking good, better, best, right? The best situation is you'd have everything we're describing, but the thing you don't want is, if you're going to omni-channel, is thinking, okay, all I do is answer email. That's my thing, right? No, it's got to be a bit more holistic than that. So let's move to this concept of swarming, because this is definitely kind of an emerging topic. It's the new cool kid word of the street, right? The reality is we get this concept of swarming. Everybody kind of gets, interested because, oh, that's new. Well, yes and no. There are some aspects to swarming which are definitely interesting and new. And by the way, this concept, the word swarm, comes from nature, where you have societies and communities like in the bee world and the ant world that seem to get all this really great work done without any kind of directive type of control, right? There aren't little ant foremen everywhere kind of, doing checklists and pointing to the next piece of work. It's this concept of self-management, cross-functional, because there's different roles in an ant colony, and it's managing towards a goal, a shared outcome, a transcendent purpose. And so this concept of swarming, we get out of this concept, and it actually is where the Agile Scrum principle comes from, by the way, because if you think about the word Scrum, that's actually from the rugby concept, where I don't have individual people who play individual roles. They pull together as a team, and they collectively flex back and forth as required to get the ball as a team to the end. So this is very much kind of the genesis of much of the learning organization and agile movement, right? So you're creating this cross-functional self-managed aspect. You're avoiding the sequential concept of support we talked about earlier. Not that there's not a place for sequential support when we have less urgency or the clock isn't ticking to the point where I have to do something different. Some areas of support can still and probably are best handled through a sequential passing of work. But other areas, especially when we talk about major incidents, we'll talk more about other types as well, would benefit more from this kind of everybody attack the problem at once, figuring out who's necessary, who's needed, and basically those people who are needed stay, and those people who are not, they go off back to whatever they were doing, right? And so we work it as a team. It's not that that's your job and this is mine. So this is where this comes from. And a lot of interesting research that kind of underlies some of the base philosophies of swarming. So again, it's kind of cool kid language, but this is not going to necessarily be all new to most of you, but at least you can translate when someone says, a drop-in swarm versus a dispatch swarm, you'll be able to translate these words into English that you understand. Right, so drop-in swarm is the concept I've already mentioned. So you've now moved your normal incident management to a point where you realize you can't tolerate delay, so everyone drops literally what they're doing, and they all swarm the issue. And ideally, as soon as the people who figure out they need to be involved they stick with it, and the others kind of peel off and go back to business as they were doing this. Now that's the ideal. It's not always what I see, Kevin. Unfortunately, what I often see is people are so focused on major incidents because they're problematic and embarrassing. They never want to live through that again. They won't let anybody leave. I was in one organization, 200-person IT shop, major incident, and everybody basically dropped everything for half a day because they all had to stay glued to the telephone, the conference call, or stuck in the conference room. So that's not what swarming is, folks, but that could be an abuse of it, right? But this drop-in swarm is something most of us have experienced. All right, that's the most probably recognizable version. The next version is called the dispatch swarm, and that's interesting. So this kind of focuses not on one incident, but a queue of work. Don't even think incidents at this point. I have a queue of work, and it could be planned work, it could be unplanned work. As I mentioned earlier, everyone is basically facing this challenge that they have more work they can possibly get to at any given day. So they've got to do something around prioritization or grooming. That's the cool kid agile word for this. Prioritization of this work, because not all of it can be seen as equal or the same urgency. So dispatch swarms work this way. You have a subject matter expert at various levels. They come to the work, the queue, all right? And they're doing a couple of things. A, it could be, well, I got that one because that one's on me and that one's my thing, and so I'll take that. And so they cherry pick. Or they could be adding clarity to the work in the queue. So this is, to increase visibility, but also increase clarity and accuracy of the information. So they increase the accuracy of a classification structure. They might be able to figure out, okay, well, the best person or group or product team to support this would be this one over here, so they can improve an assignment of it. And right, so this concept of coming in and out as the person is available to either do work on the queue or to improve the clarity and the prioritization of the queue, this is what we call a dispatch swarm. Okay. Now, the last one here, and we'll kind of dialogue and think about this a little bit here. is a backlog swarm. So this is an interesting one. So there are some things in this queue of work that require, again, this concept of a cross-functional team. Multiple subject matter experts from various disciplines or technical towers need to be assembled, not just technical, because I could bring in security and compliance and regulatory and customer voice and supplier. So when I say cross-functional, I really mean cross-functional. That we pull together a short-lived problem-solving team to tackle this one. And a lot of times that comes out of the dispatch swarm, by the way, because it's identified as needing this kind of thing. And so again, this is not new, because if you come from a lean background, you know what I'm describing as a Kaizen event, right? Or problem management type of problem analysis, root cause analysis, and then error solutioning. So problem management via ITIL would be something in this context as well. But we talk about this as a backlog swarm. Again, cool kid language, describe something we know about. But these all work together because they're all about collective work, not just individual work and passing the queue or passing the work through the queue. So thoughts, concerns, Kevin, as I describe kind of how this kind of flows?
No, so in my head, I'm thinking about the friction an organization would have if they're still stuck on multi-channel versus omni-channel support. So a good example, talking about your drop-in swarm for major incident, I think when we talk about multi-channel, you think of, well, there could be a major incident bridge set up with in the beginning, 10 technicians working, they grab more resources and they're continuing to work. But one thing I remember back from my day being operational was the first thing that would happen when somebody was brought onto the bridge call for the drop-in swarm was we had to spend 15 or 20 minutes catching them up to speed on all the things that we'd done over the last 2 hours, which wasn't really, good for productivity. You look at an omni-channel model, though, where you might have people coming in and out of this meeting. There could be a call going on. There could be collaboration, Slack type sessions going on to support this. And all this is available to the people kind of real time. So really, that the omni-channel model works really well here to make, it easier to go in and out of these major incident swarms. Also too with dispatch swarms, think about as you've got, different types of work happening, from an incident or problem perspective, you being able to have access to all the information from all these channels in one place really is key. And then, one that I'm familiar with is the backlog swarms, being able to swarm and kind of whittle down that backlog. Again, definitely would benefit from an omni-channel versus a multi-channel support model. Now, one question I have for you, and this is something that I remember from my days in IT operations, was in dispatch swarms, the cherry picking of work, right? That was always something that was frowned upon in my day of working, was you'd have certain people that would go in there and grab all 20 incident or requests for adding a group to an AD user, something that would take a minute versus, avoiding the other work. So I guess, how do you address the cherry picking? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What do you see?
It's a good thing with certain conditions. Okay, so this is going to be a page right out of the Agile kind of concepts and philosophy. So we can, as a team, improve clarity of a backlog of work, increase the understanding of, functional, non-functional requirements or prioritization, success criteria, definition of done, all of that concept. But there's still, in the Agile concept, one person who's accountable for the overall backlog and its prioritization, and that's the product owner. Or if it's not a product, it's the process owner, if we're talking problem management, or the service desk team lead, if we're talking the service desk. So there is a parent in the room who's making sure that we all use a shared understanding of prioritization and understand that prioritization is an outside-in customer-centric thing, not me and my personal opinion on the incidents that I would prefer to take on my own. In fact, this is a critical role, that this owner concept exists, that sets the policies, the boundaries, and the structure by which we do this prioritization collectively in a shared way. In fact, we can expand on that even further to say, in a self-managed, self-organized team, they're not able to take stuff anywhere off the backlog, Kevin. They can only take it from the top, because in the premise of a groom backlog, the top is the higher value, higher urgent, higher priority work. And so they might be able to cherry pick, but they can't cherry pick from the bottom. They have to be cherry picked from the top. which is a prioritization that's based on a much bigger concept and understanding than this person's personal bias or preference. Does that make sense to you as I describe it that way?
Yep. That is some great insight, Troy. Thank you for taking the time to explain that. That makes complete sense to me.
Yep. I actually had a customer challenged with this, asked me this question. We've moved to a Kanban board. We're getting visibility into our work. We're understanding the backlog. And I said, okay, well, what's the challenge? Well, we're not getting the right work done in the right time frame. And I said, well, how are you deciding what work we're doing? Well, everyone is deciding where they're going to pick work and what work they're going to pick off that Kanban backlog and pull it forward. He says, no, that's not how this works, right? You can empower the individual team members to improve clarity, but in the end, they have to use a shared understanding and transcendent purpose to understand what is first and what is second. That's why it's important to have priority models that we all use, not just, theoretically in the tool, but we use it consistently and collectively. These are the structures by which the human being community operates as a community versus individual bias. Yeah. That's a whole other conversation. So this concept, we're kind of ending up now back where we started, because your question really triggered in on the people side again, right? All of these structures are wonderful, but it comes down to how we choose to work collectively and how we understand the work from a premise of shared goals and shared objectives. It comes back to the principle that really when we talk omnichannel, I have to leave this silo mentality back to that we have shared objectives and shared outcomes, and all the channels that we now collectively leverage have to be integrated so that I can get access to shared back-end data. That I don't lose that data. I can automate and take advantage of these wonderful emerging tools like chat ops and AI ops and all of those things we talk about a lot of these webinars. It all comes back to the people side of it. And so the interesting thing is the whole premise of omnichannel, let's set that back up, has been happening for some time. And whether you were in the competitive situation or the, oh crap, I need to get more productive situation, or the, we're in the, we've been thrown into the pool and now we have to figure out how to swim. We've basically have all been on the journey. It's just, where are you in the journey of moving to these digital engagement channels? So let's imagine though that, we're all kind of collectively, at least at this point of, the situation we're facing, where the pandemic has thrown us all immediately into a world we didn't expect, at least not 6 months ago. So what happens? And all human behavior kind of follows this. Change happens in a very similar way, and it's called the grief curve by a woman by the name of Kubler-Ross, where it's originally kind of envisioned. But what happens in this kind of transitional period? Remember back to this, the change and then the transition. This is the transition. Is first we're shocked, we're kind of immobilized, and how long we stay there is a question. Good leadership will get us moving quickly, otherwise we kind of just flounder for a while. But then we pretend for a while that it's not really happening, or it's just temporary. If you remember back, Kevin, when we first started this pandemic, it's like, oh, this is a 1 week, a 2 week thing. I'm sure we'll be back up and running in the, back to normal, in 3-4 weeks. Let's figure this out. It's a really temporary thing. And so we all can, convince ourselves that this was only a temporary thing, and we'd solve this and get the whole thing figured out in 3 weeks, right? Then we realize, oh crap, that's not going to happen. Though we had to act, right? That's why we got a little bump in productivity. You'll notice that denial still doesn't, we act, we got past the shocks, we started putting in these remote systems and engagement channels. That's called good. But then we got angry because we started realizing, well, wait a minute, I didn't mean to do this permanently. I didn't plan to do this going forward. That was supposed to be temporary. And so we start to get angry. Well, no, I want to step back here and go back to email and just phone calls, right? So there's this anger that kind of emerges, and blame. We start pointing fingers, and then we start to negotiate. Well, you can have that channel, but don't expect that to be around in the new world, right? But now you've given them access to it, so you've built the bridge. You can't unbuild it. Right, so we go through this negotiating, bargaining concept, and then we get to this depression. Oh crap, the world I used to know is different, and there's no going back. And this is very interesting, because at this point, we no longer talk about going back. right? The return to, I'm sure we'll be on planes again soon. We start to actually accept that the world we're going into will look nothing like the world we just came from. And that's a real depressing time because I'm experiencing loss. And a lot of you might be in that context, right? Then I start to say, well, we could do this and we could do that, and this is actually getting us this benefit. So you start to explore the possibilities that this new world might be, if it's not better, at least livable, and maybe even better. So acceptance and exploration. To the world of, oh, yeah, that digital engagement omni-channel thing, best thing I ever thought of. is my idea, right? So this new normal we're all talking about now is we're moving beyond that. So the interesting question is, in your team, in your organization, there are people at all different stages. There could be people up there saying, I'm sure we're back in 3 weeks. Some of them might be still angry. Some might be negotiating. But here's the thing, folks. There is no going back. Pandora is out of the box. You're either going to do it well or you're not. Now, the interesting thing about this transition is it's never done. Like as soon as you get through, something else comes in and throws a spoke into the wheel. And so we're constantly going through this cycle of change. At least understanding where you are helps understand your emotional or acceptance situation. Does that make sense as we talk about this new normal to you, Kevin?
It does, and it's funny. So being that my job is now 100% remote, and I spend most of my days on calls or WebExes, kind of talking to organizations. I find that most of them, when they get toward the end of this curve, right, you get toward the stage 6 and on towards 7, they have that aha moment, right, where they realize that they're not going back, and they start seeing the silver lining, right. So it's and I read some research by MetricNet a while back talking about in 2019 the average cost of an IT support ticket or interaction fully loaded was like just a little over $100. Field support tickets were about $221 on average when we looked at the fully loaded cost there. And right now, because of the pandemic, the field support pretty much isn't happening. You're not sending technicians to people's cubicles or offices anymore. So the costs are way down. So you can really start to invest in some of these other omni-channel options when it comes to live chatbots. And honestly, the cost per interaction there is much, much lower. You're looking at, I think, a self-service ticket these days runs you about $2 fully loaded for the technology and the licensing. So it's that aha moment when you realize that maybe it's a good thing we're not going back, because we're actually going to realize cost savings and potentially better customer satisfaction, again, because I'm not waiting as long to get service. It takes me an hour to drive to a downtown office to fix your laptop, but heck, I can do it with my remote control tool right here from my desk and have you up and running in 5 minutes. So I think it's a golden opportunity for us to rethink how we do support, and a lot of organizations are seeing that today.
Let me see what you just said. Quality improves, speed improves, and cost reduces. That sounds like value to me. I think we kind of started this whole conversation right there. Increase value on all 3 dimensions. Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's rare to get all 3, right? But I think now is the time, and people are doing it. So it's fantastic to see.
Well, the reality is we used to be told this concept of quality, cost, and speed, you can't have all 3. Well, horseradish. Because if you start reducing variability, right, reducing technical debt, what happens? You improve quality, increase speed, and lower cost. But that means moving from this patchwork of unintended oops by accident approach to your support model to an intentional integrated holistic approach, right? The key here, folks, and I hope you've gotten this message, is that the pandemic didn't create this journey. It just accelerated it, right? I love this quote. Change has never happened this fast before, and it will never be this slow again. Right? The reality is we've all been on this journey, is that we're at different parts of the journey. Some of us might still be up there in the anger space, but the reality is it's not happening, right? And if you take a look at some of the quotes here on the screen, the reality is that organizations are doing this and they're having to face the reality of the new normal. Okay, so that's just where we are. So with that, I think we've tackled this question probably sufficiently, Kevin.
I think so, Troy.
Well, thank you, Troy and Kevin. That was very informative, and I am sure this will be valuable to everyone listening today. Okay, it looks like we have time for just a couple questions. Just a reminder, if we don't get to your question, or if you are listening to this webinar in a recorded version, you can submit your questions to im@axiosystems.com. I think we only have time for maybe one or two. Okay, so first question. I think it can go to either one of you, but what would the critical success factors be for omni-channel support?
Well, that could go a couple different ways. We could talk technology, we could talk about teaming, and we could talk about culture. Why don't you take the technical one? Go for it, Kevin.
I can do that. Yeah, so it really comes down to what I think from an omni-channel perspective, critical success factors, what, from a technology standpoint, what tools do you have today, and what channels and how are you measuring those channels? So I think a good rule of thumb I talk to people about when they're looking at going through here is, once they've decided to go omni-channel, is helping them define, metrics to support the cost, productivity, and quality of that service. So I'll pick on chat, since most people are starting to take live chat a bit more seriously. I think some good metrics to measure here to support your CSF would be things like I think cost per chat is averaging about $16 right now. I measure things like what's your average minutes of handled chat time, similar to what we did for phone support back in the day. I would also measure how many chats per month we're doing per agent, and I take a look at the customer satisfaction level of that as well. Now, something we didn't talk about today, I think is important, is when we look at some of these other channels, we've got the ability for agents to do more than one thing at a time. In the old days when I would field phone calls, I could only solve one issue on the phone at a time. Fast forward to today, I think when we pick on chat as an example, most organizations I work with have agents that are working in the chat channel do 2, 3, or sometimes even 4, simultaneous conversations. So I'd also measure what the average chat session, how many chats they're handling at one time, and I'd measure that against the customer sat to make sure they're not providing a lesser service. So from a technology standpoint, I think that's how I would handle it in measuring it to see how we're being successful. Troy, I'm interested from a cultural standpoint what you see here. So can you talk a little bit about culture, what you measure on the culture side?
Yeah, so the technical, you can say, is kind of like the enabling factor, because if we don't have an enabling factor, it's challenging to achieve our goals. But here's my observation. See, nothing we talked about today was relatively new. It was just looking at it and maybe explaining it in some new terms. So we have the tools. We have great tools like Axios systems and the products that you guys sell, integrated with other, organizational tools as well. We have knowledge. We've got so many reference models and best practice books out there, we could shake a stick at them. So it's not a lack of tools, and it's not a lack of knowledge. Then what stops us from actually getting this done, to actually achieving this transformational goal we talked about earlier? And it's this concept of, I'd rather work in a silo than in a team. And if I say team, it's my individual team. It's not the we team across the, the greater IT, or maybe even the greater business concept. So it's this real silo mentality that we struggle with today, that in my opinion is eating our lunch, right? So the reality is, for us to actually to get this going, to create the emphasis for transformation, we have to move to this more collaborative, we the people find something self-evident and true, with shared goals and shared objectives, leveraging shared tools. And that, in my opinion, is the hardest thing, because it's not a tool challenge, it's not a knowledge challenge. Then why aren't we doing it? Organizational will, culture, and the lack of leadership that is empowering the first two. My biggest concern.
All right. Well, thank you. Okay, I think we only have time to get one more question. I'm going to go ahead and squeeze it in. Do you have any suggestions on how we can help improve the skill sets of our team members to better equip them as we move towards this omni-channel approach?
There's an old saying, Kirsty, hire for attitude and aptitude versus technical, right? So the technical you can learn. It's a lot harder to find people with empathy, EQ, and good communication skills. I would start there and then add the technical. Or if you had to choose, go with the attitude and aptitude and then bring in the technical. Don't start with the technical and think you're going to teach Sheldon Cooper how to be a people. You know, it's start with the end in mind.
Good point, Troy. All right,
Yeah, I
everyone.
totally agree. I think one thing I do also, Kirsty.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. I said one thing I would also look at too is the training, the yearly retraining of service desk staff. Historically, I've seen it be much more around technology, but to Troy's point, I think there's the benefit you can start training them yearly and refreshers on some of these softer skills, right? You know, the technical stuff you're going to acquire over time by working with your customers, you know, by using the knowledge base and leveraging the information. But I think really start to focus some of your yearly training and evaluations on those softer skills we've been talking about. And that's, I think, what I would change from what we've done historically to what we could be doing in the future for a better, better analyst.
Hear, hear.
Very well. All right. Thank you again, Troy and Kevin. That was an excellent webinar. Everyone, we appreciate you joining and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.